In the summer of 1945, on an afternoon that no declassified record has fixed to a specific date, a woman in her early 30s made her way through the heat of Albuquerque's Union Station toward the eastbound platform. She carried a brown leather handbag and a small cardboard box of Kleenex tissues. She wore a light cotton dress, flat shoes practical for travel, and the expression of someone who did not want to be remembered. Her name was Lona Cohen. She was 32 years old. Within the Soviet intelligence apparatus, she was known by a single codename, Leslie. She was a former seamstress from the Bronx, the daughter of Polish immigrants, a committed communist, and by the summer of 1945, one of the most consequential couriers in the history of atomic espionage. Inside the cardboard box, folded flat and pressed between the lower layers of tissues, was a sheaf of handwritten papers accompanied by a set of technical diagrams. Those documents described, in precise engineering detail, the implosion lens design of the Fat Man plutonium bomb, the weapon that, within weeks, would be detonated over Nagasaki, Japan, killing between 40 and 80,000 people in a matter of seconds. Cohen had been trained, as all couriers were, not to read what she carried. She understood the material was important and that it related to the classified laboratory in the mountains to the north. The physics contained in those pages she could not have articulated even if she had wanted to, but she understood their value well enough to know that if she were stopped, if a station official or a federal agent asked her to open that cardboard box, there was no explanation available to her that would save her. The train pulled out of Albuquerque's Union Station and began its route east toward Kansas City, then Chicago, then New York. Lona Cohen took her seat, placed her handbag on her lap, and looked out the window at the wide, bleached landscape of the New Mexico desert receding behind her. She would not be stopped. She would not be searched. The documents would reach her handler in New York, would be photographed, and the images would be transmitted to Moscow. They would form a central piece of the intelligence that allowed the Soviet Union to detonate its own atomic bomb on August 29th, 1949, years earlier than Western analysts had believed possible, and years earlier than it would have been without what Lona Cohen was carrying out of New Mexico on that summer afternoon. The atomic age looked different after that train ride. The balance of terror that would hold two superpowers and the entire world in a condition of mutual destruction for the next 4 decades had been altered, in some measurable part, by a woman on a passenger train with a cardboard box of tissues. If the hidden human stories behind Cold War intelligence, the couriers, the dead drops, the documents carried in plain sight, are stories you want to understand more deeply, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we reconstruct these documented cases from the archives, one complete story at a time. Now, who was Lona Cohen, and how did a woman from the Bronx come to carry the most dangerous secret in modern history out of New Mexico on a passenger train? Lona Cohen was born Leontine Teresa Pita on January 11, 1913, in Adams, Massachusetts, the daughter of Polish immigrants who had arrived in the United States in the early years of the century. Her father, Vincent Pita, worked in the textile mills that dominated the industrial economy of western Massachusetts, and the family's circumstances were modest, defined by the rhythms of shift work and the particular anxieties of immigrant working-class life in the decade following the First World War. The work was hard and the wages were narrow, and the family lived inside the specific financial precariousness that characterized the lives of mill workers in a New England textile town that was already beginning to feel the first pressures of industrial decline. The family later relocated to New York City, eventually settling in the Bronx, where Lona grew up in the dense, polyglot neighborhoods of the outer borough during the 1920s and into the Depression years. By the accounts of people who knew her during this period, and by her own later testimony to Soviet intelligence, debriefers whose records were partially released after the Cold War's end, Lona was intelligent, energetic, and politically aware in ways that were common among young people from immigrant working-class communities during the worst years of the Depression. The political landscape of the early 1930s, with its mass unemployment reaching 25% of the workforce, its labor conflicts and street battles, and its stark economic divisions between a small class of great wealth and enormous numbers of people who had none, pushed many young Americans, particularly those from immigrant communities with direct experience of poverty, toward left-wing political movements. Lona Cohen was among them. She attended meetings, read radical literature, and became involved with organizations affiliated with or sympathetic to the American Communist Party. These affiliations were not secretive at the time. They were, in the neighborhoods where she moved, a form of civic participation as much as ideological commitment. Thousands of Americans in the Bronx and in similar communities across the northeastern cities joined similar organizations during the 1930s, seeing in Soviet communism what appeared to be a working model of the society they wished their own country would become. In the fall of 1935, while working as a seamstress and attending classes at the New York Workers' School, a Communist Party educational institution in Manhattan that offered courses in Marxist theory, labor history, and political economy, Lona met a young man named Morris Cohen. Morris Cohen was 24 years old at the time, turning 25 that December, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants from the Lower East Side, and a committed communist who had recently returned from studies at Mississippi State College, where he had attended on a football scholarship before his political activities drew the attention of the administration, and his time there came to an early end. He was energetic and persuasive, with a natural talent for connecting with people across the various factions and subcultures of the city's left-wing world. By most accounts, the attraction between Lona and Morris was immediate and mutual, rooted not only in personal chemistry but in shared political conviction and a shared sense that the world they had been born into was one that required fundamental transformation. Morris Cohen went to Spain in 1937 to fight with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against the fascist forces of Francisco Franco, one of approximately 3,000 Americans who volunteered for the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. The experience in Spain was formative for Morris in ways that extended well beyond combat. He witnessed the discipline and organizational capacity of Soviet military advisors embedded within the Republican forces. He developed relationships with men who would later prove to be Soviet intelligence officers, and he returned from Spain in 1938 with the kind of conviction that comes from having put one's body on the ground in a cause, tested, hardened, and more committed than before. It was in Spain, according to intelligence assessments based on Soviet archival materials that became accessible to researchers after 1991, that Morris Cohen first came into meaningful contact with Soviet intelligence officers embedded within the international brigades. The recruitment of Americans who had volunteered to fight fascism was a deliberate and systematic Soviet intelligence practice during this period. The Lincoln Brigade volunteers were, by definition, ideologically committed, willing to accept physical risk for their beliefs, and deeply sympathetic to the Soviet Union as the principal military opponent of European fascism. In the language of intelligence tradecraft, they were natural candidates for development as assets, and they were cultivated accordingly. Morris and Lona were married on July 13, 1941. By that time, according to Soviet intelligence records later made available to researchers, Morris had already been formally recruited as an asset by the NKVD, the Soviet state security organization that preceded the KGB, and had been given his first operational instructions. His primary handler was a Soviet intelligence officer named Semyon Semyonov, who worked under diplomatic cover in New York and who managed multiple assets within the American scientific and industrial community. The relationship was professional and carefully structured. Semyonov was experienced, methodical, and deeply embedded in the world of New York's left-wing intellectual and professional communities, which provided him natural access to the people he was tasked with developing and managing. Lona's formal recruitment into the network followed shortly afterward. It was handled carefully and with her full knowledge and agreement. Soviet intelligence records indicate that her recruiters recognized from early in the process that her composure under pressure, her physical courage, and her natural inconspicuousness, a woman in ordinary clothes, performing ordinary tasks, was among the most effective career profiles available. made her a more reliable operational asset than many of the people already working within the network. She would prove them right. In 1943, Morris Cohen was drafted into the United States Army and assigned to serve in Europe, which effectively removed him from active operational work for the duration of the war in that theater. This left Lona as the active partner in whatever tasks the Soviet residency required from the Cohen network. For a time, this meant routine work, meeting contacts at prearranged locations, receiving and delivering documents, passing messages, performing the unglamorous, repetitive work of a courier that constitutes most of what intelligence networks actually do on a day-to-day basis. Much of it, from the outside, was entirely invisible. Then, in the late spring of 1945, Lona's handler assigned to her something of an entirely different order. The Manhattan Project, the American program to develop an atomic bomb, initiated in 1942 and codenamed after the New York City borough, where its administrative offices were first located, had by the spring of 1945 reached the operational phase toward which years of scientific and industrial effort had been building. At the project's primary weapons design facility, the Los Alamos laboratory, constructed on a remote mesa in the mountains of northern New Mexico and administered by the United States Army with the University of California providing scientific management, approximately 5,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, and support staff worked under conditions of extreme secrecy. Mail was censored. Travel outside the laboratory community required authorization. Residents were identified on their official documents only by their post office box number. The town of Los Alamos did not officially exist. The laboratory's scientific director was J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the most distinguished theoretical physicists in the country, who managed the competing intellectual personalities of his scientific staff with a combination of charisma, political skill, and an unusual ability to translate between pure theory and practical engineering. The project as a whole was the most expensive and most carefully compartmentalized scientific undertaking in American history, consuming roughly $2 billion and producing, by the summer of 1945, two functional weapons of a kind the world had never seen. The atmosphere at Los Alamos in those years was one of extraordinary intellectual intensity, operating under extraordinary constraint. Scientists who had in their previous lives published freely, collaborated openly across institutional boundaries, and regarded the exchange of ideas as the fundamental currency of scientific progress, found themselves working in a community where even the name of the institution could not be acknowledged outside it, where correspondence with family was read before it left the facility, and where they could not tell their parents or their spouses what they were working on. Most of them accepted this as the necessary price of the work's importance. But no security protocol has ever fully contained the human realities of 5,000 people living and working together. Ideas, concerns, convictions, and doubts circulated through the networks of friendship and professional relationship that institutional rules can restrict but cannot extinguish, and in that circulation the decisions of individuals, what they believed, what they feared, what they were willing to do, were shaped by forces that operated below the level of any clearance review. Despite the precautions, Soviet intelligence had achieved significant penetration of the Manhattan Project through multiple channels operating independently of one another. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born theoretical physicist who had been naturalized as a British citizen and was working at Los Alamos as part of the British scientific mission, had been providing classified information to Soviet handlers since at least 1944. His access to the theoretical foundations of bomb design was extensive, and the material he provided was of the highest value. David Greenglass, an army machinist working in the laboratory's precision engineering shops, and the brother of Ethel Rosenberg, whose husband Julius was running a separate Soviet intelligence network in New York, was passing information about specific bomb components and assembly methods through the Rosenberg Channel. These penetrations were among the most damaging intelligence losses in American history. But in the fall of 1944, a penetration of a different kind began, one that originated not from a recruited asset, not from coercion or financial inducement, but from the voluntary decision of one of the youngest scientists working anywhere on the project. Theodore Alvin Hall was born on October 20th, 1925, in Far Rockaway, New York, the son of a furrier and his wife. He was a child of exceptional mathematical ability, the kind that announces itself clearly and early. He was admitted to Harvard University in the fall of 1940 at the age of 14, turning 15 that October during his first semester, among the youngest students in the university's history. He graduated in the spring of 1944 at the age of 18 and was recruited almost immediately to Los Alamos, where he arrived as one of the youngest physicists working on weapons design anywhere in the project. The work he was assigned involved the theoretical calculations underlying the implosion approach to nuclear detonation, the technical problem that had emerged as the central challenge of the plutonium weapon. Hall's motivations, as he described them in interviews given decades later, and as analyzed by researchers working from the declassified Venona transcripts and Soviet archival materials, were not financial. He received no significant payment for what he subsequently did. He was, by his own account, frightened, not of the bomb itself, though he understood its destructive capacity better than almost anyone alive, but of the geopolitical world that would follow if only one nation possessed atomic weapons. He was 18 years old when he arrived at Los Alamos, and 19 when he acted. He was brilliant, formed intellectually in the progressive political environment of wartime American universities, and persuaded that ideology could be mapped onto the physics of international relations in ways that justified the choice he was about to make. In October 1944, Hall made contact with Soviet intelligence through Saville Sachs, a fellow student at Harvard with whom he shared roots in the Chicago area, and with whom he had developed the kind of close political friendship that the progressive intellectual circles of wartime American universities frequently produced. Sachs traveled to New York, located the Soviet intelligence apparatus operating through the city's residency, and delivered an initial communication from Hall. Hall subsequently met directly with Soviet handlers. The relationship was formalized, and the intelligence flow began. His codename in Soviet communications was MLAD, a Russian word meaning young or youngster, which was both an accurate description of his age and, in retrospect, an institutional acknowledgment of the extraordinary youth of the person who had voluntarily offered one of the most significant intelligence windfalls of the entire Cold War. The specific material Hall prepared for transfer in the late spring of 1945 concerned the implosion lens design of the plutonium bomb. By that point in the project, the two approaches to nuclear weapon design had been clearly differentiated, and the physics of each was well understood within Los Alamos. The simpler gun-type design, which would be used in the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima, worked by firing one subcritical mass of uranium into another at high velocity, triggering supercriticality and the resulting chain reaction. Plutonium, however, could not be assembled using this method. The material's properties meant that premature detonation was virtually certain before the two masses could fully join, producing at best a fizzle, a conventional explosion that scattered plutonium without achieving nuclear yield. The solution that Los Alamos had developed, after years of theoretical and engineering work, was implosion, a precisely engineered, spherical array of explosive lenses arranged around a plutonium core that, when detonated simultaneously, would compress the core from all sides with equal force, driving it to supercriticality in fractions of a second. The technical demands were extraordinary. The explosive lenses had to be machined to extremely precise tolerances. The detonators had to fire within microseconds of one another. The geometry had to be exact. Getting any of it wrong meant failure. Getting all of it right meant the destruction of a city. That geometry, the specific engineering solution that transformed a theoretical principle into a functional weapon, was what Theodore Hall had written down. It was what he had passed to Saville Sachs, and it was what Lona Cohen had been dispatched to New Mexico to collect. Lona Cohen's handler conveyed her assignment sometime in late May 1945. The briefing followed standard operational protocol. She was given a destination, a cover story, a contact procedure, a recognition signal, and instructions about how to handle whatever she received. She was given clear guidance about what to do if the meeting did not go as planned, and what to do if she was approached by anyone who seemed to be conducting surveillance of her movements. She was not given a full explanation of what she was collecting. This was deliberate. The less a courier understood about the material they were carrying, the less damage could be done, either intentionally through betrayal or involuntarily through capture, to the broader operation. She traveled by train to Albuquerque, arriving sometime in the first days of that summer. The city was in those final months of the war a place visibly transformed by the military and scientific presence that had descended on the region over the previous 3 years. Soldiers and uniformed personnel were everywhere. Civilian workers moved through the streets with the careful, slightly abstracted demeanor of people accustomed to inhabiting classified worlds. New restaurants and hotels had opened to serve the expanded population. The streets had the particular energy of a city that had grown quickly and under unusual pressures. Lona checked into a hotel. The specific establishment is not established in the available declassified record, and waited for the meeting she had been sent to conduct. The meeting took place at a location that subsequent accounts have described as a public space within the city, likely a street corner or a park, somewhere ordinary and visible to no one in particular. The encounter was designed to be brief. Saville Sachs, who had served as the original intermediary between Hall and Soviet intelligence, appears to have been the person Lona met, arriving in Albuquerque carrying the material Hall had prepared and passed to him, almost certainly during a visit that brought Sachs close enough to the region for the handoff to be arranged. What is documented in Soviet intelligence records, and what Hall himself confirmed in interviews before his death, is that a transfer of documents took place in Albuquerque in the summer of 1945, that those documents contained technical information about the implosion lens design, and that the courier who received them was Lona Cohen. The documents were folded and placed inside the Kleenex box. The choice of a Kleenex box as a concealment device was practical, rather than elegant. It was something a woman traveling alone might plausibly carry, something that required no explanation, something that a hurried or superficial inspection might overlook. The tissues provided both concealment and a degree of cushioning for papers that needed to survive a long journey intact. The selection reflected the unglamorous, improvisational quality of much actual intelligence work, which tends to rely less on sophisticated technology than on the ordinary logic of what observers notice and what they do not. At Albuquerque's Union Station, an event occurred that would enter Soviet intelligence institutional memory as one of the most consequential near misses in the history of atomic espionage. According to accounts preserved in Soviet archives and later described by Lona Cohen herself in debriefings with KGB officers, accounts whose specific details vary slightly across different tellings and whose full circumstances have not been independently corroborated. She was stopped at the station by a plainclothesman or law enforcement official who had become suspicious of her. The precise agency and the exact nature of the suspicion are not fully established in the available sources. It may have been routine scrutiny of a woman traveling alone, or something in her behavior that registered as unusual, or simply a procedural check of the kind that wartime security conditions had normalized across the country's transportation hubs. The official questioned her, examined her identification, and then the exact sequence of what transpired over those several minutes is not fully reconstructible from available records, allowed her to proceed. Whether the Kleenex box was physically examined during this encounter is one of the small historical uncertainties that cluster around the operation. Soviet accounts suggest it was not, or that if it was, the examiner did not locate the concealed documents. The outcome is not in dispute. Lona Cohen boarded the train with the documents intact. She traveled east through the desert and the plains, through Kansas City and Chicago, and delivered what she was carrying to her handler in New York without further incident. The documents were photographed. The photographs were transmitted to Moscow through the mechanisms the Soviet residency in New York had established for exactly this purpose, channels that included diplomatic couriers and the residency's encrypted cipher communications. Soviet intelligence officers received the technical diagrams and handwritten papers. sometime in the summer of 1945, before the Trinity test on July the 16th at the Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range in southern New Mexico, before the bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, before the bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, before the world at large understood what the American scientists had built in the mountains, what the Soviet atomic weapons program made of the material Lona Cohen delivered is a question that historians and physicists have examined carefully since the relevant documents began entering the public record in the 1990s. The conclusions that research has produced are significant. The Soviet bomb tested at the Semipalatinsk facility in northeastern Kazakhstan on August 29, 1949, was a plutonium implosion device whose design bore unmistakable structural similarities to the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Soviet archives have confirmed that intelligence from multiple sources inside the Manhattan Project, including the material transmitted through the Cohen network and through Klaus Fuchs, was incorporated systematically into the Soviet design effort. Igor Kurchatov, the scientific director of the Soviet atomic program, was meticulous about documenting how intelligence material was used to guide and accelerate the work at each phase of the program. His records, where they have become available to researchers, establish clearly that the implosion lens designs Hall provided were used directly in Soviet theoretical calculations and engineering planning. The Soviet program did not copy the American bomb wholesale. It adapted and verified the intelligence it received through its own scientific work, but the intelligence shortened the path enormously by confirming which approaches would work and sparing Soviet scientists the years of trial and error that independent derivation would have required. Western analysts before 1949 had generally estimated that the Soviet Union would not have an operational atomic weapon until the mid-1950s at the earliest. Some estimates placed the likely date as late as 1960. The actual test came in August 1949, a minimum of 4 years ahead of the most optimistic Western projections, and substantially more ahead of the later ones. When President Truman announced on September 23, 1949, that the Soviet Union had detonated an atomic device, characterizing it with careful understatement as an atomic explosion, the announcement came as a shock to the American public and to most of the American government. The intelligence gap between what had been expected and what had actually occurred was stark, and the implications were immediate. The strategy of extended nuclear monopoly, on which American post-war security planning had been quietly predicated, evaporated in a single announcement. The question was no longer when the Soviet Union would have the bomb. It already had one. All the calculations built on the assumption that the United States alone controlled this technology had to be remade under the pressure of a new reality, a reality that Lona Cohen had helped create by boarding a train in Albuquerque 4 years earlier. The Korean War began in June 1950, less than a year after the Soviet test, and was fought in the shadow of the knowledge that both sides were now nuclear powers. The first hydrogen bomb tests followed in the early 1950s, with both superpowers racing to develop weapons of even greater destructive capacity. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the verge of nuclear exchange in October 1962, 13 years after the Soviet test that Lona Cohen's Courier run had helped make possible. The entire architecture of nuclear deterrence, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, the arms control negotiations, the nuclear test bans, the civil defense systems, the constant background understanding that a mistake could end civilization depended on both superpowers possessing functional nuclear arsenals simultaneously and both sides knowing it. That architecture did not exist before August 29, 1949, and the specific years by which the Soviet program was accelerated were precisely the years in which the foundational confrontations of the Cold War were shaped, and the fundamental decisions about American nuclear strategy and Western collective defense were made under their pressure. Those decisions were made in a world where the Soviet Union already had the bomb. They would have been made differently in a world where it did not. How differently, and to what ultimate effect, is genuinely impossible to determine, but differently. In the Bronx, in the summer and fall of 1945, Lona Cohen returned to the life she had been living. Morris came home from Europe after the German surrender and resumed his work within the network. The couple maintained the cover of an ordinary working-class household in the city, worked various jobs, attended meetings and social events in the progressive communities they had always moved through, and continued to meet with their handler and perform whatever tasks the residency required. Their lives looked from the outside entirely unremarkable. Nothing about their apartment or their routines or their friendships suggested that one of them had, a few months earlier, changed the trajectory of the post-war world on a passenger train in New Mexico. For nearly 5 years, they continued this way without significant incident. Then, in 1950, the world they were living inside began to come apart. On February 3, 1950, Klaus Fuchs, the German-born British theoretical physicist who had been one of the most productive Soviet assets inside the Manhattan Project, was arrested by British authorities on espionage charges. Fuchs had been identified through a combination of signals intelligence intercepts and investigation by MI5, whose analysts had detected a reference in a partially decoded wartime transmission that pointed toward a British scientist working in atomic research. Under sustained interrogation, Fuchs confessed in detail. His confession provided the FBI with leads that extended through the American communist networks connected to the Manhattan Project, and the Bureau moved quickly. Within months, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and David Greenglass had been identified, arrested, and charged with espionage. The Rosenbergs would be executed on June 19, 1953, the only American civilians put to death for espionage during the Cold War. The Cohen network was not directly connected to the Rosenberg operation in organizational terms. Soviet intelligence maintained strict compartmentalization between different networks precisely to prevent the collapse of one from triggering the collapse of others. But both networks existed within the same overlapping world of American communist sympathizers who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence during the wartime years, and the exposure of one increased the risk to all of the others. As the FBI's investigation expanded and the pressure on remaining assets intensified, Moscow made the decision to extract the Cohens from the United States before they could be identified and arrested. In late 1950, Morris and Lona Cohen left the United States. The precise logistics of their departure have not been fully established from available records. The documentation they used, the route they took, the contacts who facilitated their extraction. What the record does establish is that they were almost certainly removed using Soviet intelligence resources and false papers, and that their departure was sudden enough to allow for no goodbyes. They did not inform their families they were leaving. They did not close their accounts or give notice to their landlord or say farewell to their friends. Morris's parents, by accounts that reached researchers decades later, spent years not knowing whether their son was alive or dead. The silence was not cruelty on the Cohens' part. It was operational necessity of a kind they had long since accepted as the condition of the life they were living. For several years, the Cohens moved through various countries under assumed identities, spending significant time in the Soviet Union, being retrained in updated tradecraft, familiarized with new technologies and communication methods, and prepared for a new operational role. The KGB, formally established in March 1954, following the comprehensive restructuring of the Soviet security apparatus that began after Stalin's death the previous year, had made a decision about where the Cohens could be most useful. They were too experienced, too thoroughly trained, and too deeply trusted to retire. The question was only where to deploy them. The answer was England. In June of 1954, a couple identifying themselves as Peter and Helen Kroger arrived in England, presenting documentation indicating New Zealand citizenship. Peter Kroger described himself as an antiquarian book dealer with a particular interest in Americana. Helen, his wife, appeared to be a housewife of conventional habits and modest social ambitions. They were, as they presented themselves, an unremarkable middle-aged couple who had developed an interest in England's literary culture and wished to establish a small business in the rare and second-hand book trade. In 1955, Peter Kroger registered a business dealing in books, principally vintage American publications, for which a niche collector's market existed among British buyers, and the business operated quietly and without particular distinction. He attended book fairs, cultivated a small network of dealers and collectors, and maintained the professional surface of a man genuinely committed to his trade. He was, by the accounts of people who dealt with him in this capacity, knowledgeable and agreeable, if somewhat reserved. There was nothing about him that invited further inquiry. The couple eventually purchased a bungalow at 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip, a suburb in the outer reaches of West London defined by the particular quiet domesticity that characterized English middle-class suburban life in the post-war decade. The bungalow was modest, well-maintained, with a small rear garden, net curtains in the front windows, and the general appearance of a home occupied by people who were settled, respectable, and not particularly interesting to anyone who passed by. Neighbors later recalled the Krogers as pleasant if somewhat reserved, the sort of people who would exchange pleasantries over the garden fence, but who did not actively cultivate social engagement. Peter was occasionally seen at local book fairs and antiquarian events. Helen baked for neighborhood gatherings and kept the garden tidy. Nothing about their life at 45 Cranley Drive attracted attention. That was, of course, precisely the point. Within the bungalow, concealed with considerable technical sophistication, was a radio transmitter capable of communicating with Moscow. There were high-speed burst transmission devices that could send encrypted messages and compressed signals, too brief to be reliably intercepted and triangulated by counterintelligence monitoring equipment. There were microdot cameras capable of reducing a page of typescript to the size of a punctuation mark. There were one-time cipher pads for encoding and decoding messages. There were additional technical materials constituting, in aggregate, a fully equipped covert communications center of the kind that required significant KGB technical and logistical support to install and maintain. Peter and Helen Kroger were, in the operational language of Soviet intelligence, a support couple, a pair of experienced assets providing the logistical and communications infrastructure through which a more active intelligence officer operating in the area could transmit what he collected back to Moscow. That officer was a man known in England as Gordon Lonsdale, who held a Canadian passport and moved with apparent ease through the professional and social world surrounding the Admiralty underwater weapons establishment at Portland on the Dorset coast. Lonsdale, whose actual name was Konon Trofimovich Malady, a career KGB officer born in Moscow in 1922 who had been given a Canadian identity in childhood, was running an intelligence operation targeting British naval secrets, particularly information about the sonar and submarine detection technologies that Britain was developing in close collaboration with the United States Navy. Harry Houghton, a civilian employee at the Portland establishment who had previously served at the British Naval Attaché's office in Warsaw and had there come under Soviet pressure, and Ethel G., a records clerk at the same facility, who was Houghton's companion, were the sources providing Lonsdale with classified documents from inside the establishment. The intelligence Lonsdale was collecting was regarded in Moscow as highly valuable, and the communications infrastructure at 45 Cranley Drive was the mechanism by which that intelligence traveled from Portland through London to Moscow. The Portland Spy Ring, as it came to be called after its exposure, was identified through a combination of MI5 counterintelligence work and information provided by a defector, Michael Goleniewski, a Polish intelligence officer who had been providing information to the CIA and who pointed Western intelligence toward the Portland facility's civilian workforce. The surveillance operation that the security service subsequently mounted in late 1960 eventually established the full operational structure. The Portland sources, the handler in London, and the support couple in Ruislip, whose bungalow served as the communications hub. The operation had the careful, methodical quality that MI5's counterintelligence work at its best produced, and when the decision was made to move, it was comprehensive. On January 7, 1961, officers from the Special Branch of the Metropolitan Police arrested Gordon Lonsdale in central London as he completed an exchange of materials with Houghton and G. At approximately the same hour on the same day, officers arrived at 45 Cranley Drive and placed Peter and Helen Kroger under arrest. The search of the bungalow that followed was among the most consequential evidence-gathering operations in the history of British counterintelligence. Hidden beneath a trapdoor cut into the kitchen floor, officers found the high-speed radio transmitter and receiver, the cipher pads, the microdot camera, and substantial quantities of materials associated with covert communications. They found a tin of talcum powder that had been hollowed out to form a concealment cavity for microdots or film. They found a cigarette lighter adapted for the same purpose. They found, buried in the garden, a container holding additional materials. They found, in the pages of books on the shelves, hidden items. The bungalow at 45 Cranley Drive was, it turned out, rather more interesting than it had appeared from the street. The fingerprints of Peter and Helen Kroger were checked against FBI records. They matched the fingerprints of Morris Cohen and Lona Cohen, which had been taken from records collected before the couple's disappearance from New York a decade earlier. The quiet book dealer and his wife, who had lived in Ruislip for 6.5 years, were the same two people who had operated as couriers and contacts inside the Soviet intelligence network in New York during the 1940s. The same two people who had vanished without explanation when the Rosenberg case began dismantling the American network in 1950. Lona Cohen, Helen Kroger, was 47 years old when officers arrested her at the bungalow on Cranley Drive. According to the accounts of the arresting officers, she remained composed throughout the arrest. She asked whether she could brush her teeth before being taken in. The request was declined. The trial of the Portland spy ring opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in London in March 1961. The 5 defendants were Gordon Lonsdale, Peter Kroger, Helen Kroger, Harry Houghton, and Ethel G., all charged under the Official Secrets Act. The case against the Krogers rested primarily on the physical evidence recovered during the search of 45 Cranley Drive, the radio equipment, the cipher materials, the microdot technology, supplemented by the fingerprint identification that established their true identities as Morris and Lona Cohen. The presence of a high-speed burst radio transmitter and a set of one-time cipher pads beneath the kitchen floor of a private residence in outer London was not amenable to any innocent explanation, and the defense did not seriously attempt one. Their counsel argued, as counsel in espionage cases must, that the evidence required a certain interpretation and that alternative readings could not be definitively excluded. The jury was not persuaded. On March 22, 1961, Peter and Helen Kroger, Morris and Lona Cohen were convicted under the Official Secrets Act. On March 25, 1961, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker of Waddington, sentenced both of them to 20 years' imprisonment. The sentencing remarks noted the gravity of the offenses and the degree to which the defendants had embedded themselves within British society as a platform for sustained intelligence work. What the sentencing did not address, because it was not part of the British prosecution and was not known to the court, was the full scope of what the Cohens had done in the United States. The atomic courier work, the New Mexico operation, the summer of 1945, the Kleenex box, the documents that had reached Moscow before the Trinity test. The British court sentenced them for what they had done at 45 Cranley Drive. The larger history remained, for the moment, contained within the classified files of intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic. Morris Cohen was sent to Wormwood Scrubs, the Victorian-era prison in West London. Lona Cohen was sent to Holloway Prison in North London, the institution that served as England's primary facility for women prisoners. Holloway was a structure of its era, a Victorian Gothic building that had opened in 1852 and that retained, nearly a century later, the punishing physical character of an institution designed more as a statement of deterrence than as a place of human habitation. It was cold in winter, crowded in all seasons, and structured around routines of labor and confinement that offered limited opportunity for the kind of reflective existence that a woman of Lona Cohen's intelligence and political formation might have sought. She was 47 years old when she entered Holloway, and she would not leave for 8 years. In the United States, the FBI had by that point assembled a substantial classified file on the Cohens. The Venona Project, a signals intelligence program that had been working since 1943 to decrypt Soviet communications transmitted between Moscow and the Soviet residency in New York, had identified both Morris and Lona Cohen as significant assets within the Soviet network. The codename Leslie appeared in Venona, decrypts in direct connection with a female courier who had collected material from Hall, referred to in those same decrypts under the codename MLAD. The decrypts established Lona Cohen's role in the atomic courier operation with a clarity that would, under ordinary evidentiary circumstances, have formed the foundation of a straightforward prosecution. But the decrypts were classified. The existence of the Venona Project itself was classified, and disclosing the program in open court would have alerted Soviet intelligence to the fact that the United States had been successfully reading their wartime communications, a compromise that the intelligence community regarded as far more damaging to ongoing security than any individual prosecution. The evidence that established Lona Cohen's guilt most clearly was the evidence that could never be used against her. This was a constraint the FBI and the Justice Department would face repeatedly across the Cold War, possessing intelligence that established guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but being unable to introduce it without revealing the existence of the program that had produced it. The FBI had also identified Theodore Hall from the Venona material. In 1951, following the Fuchs arrest and the rapid expansion of the investigation into Manhattan Project penetrations, Hall was interviewed by bureau agents. He acknowledged that he had provided information to Soviet contacts during the war, but he declined to elaborate, and the available admissible evidence, absent the Venona transcripts that could not be disclosed, was insufficient to support a viable prosecution. No charges were filed. Hall left the United States in 1962 and accepted a position as a physicist at the Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge in England, where he would work for the remainder of his scientific career in the fields of biophysics and X-ray microscopy. What followed from that relocation was a geographic coincidence of considerable historical weight. During the years when Lona Cohen was serving her sentence at Holloway Prison in North London, the physicist whose diagrams she had carried out of New Mexico was conducting research at a laboratory approximately 60 miles to the north. Both were living inside specific and different forms of silence, Cohen within the institutional silence of imprisonment, Hall within the silence of a history he had acknowledged to federal agents but had not spoken of publicly, and could not. Neither could speak openly about the act that connected them. Neither could say in the ordinary world they were each inhabiting in different ways what they knew about a summer afternoon in Albuquerque 20 years earlier. The distance between Holloway and Cambridge was 60 miles on any map. It was rather longer than that by any other measure. The 8 years between the Cohens' conviction and their eventual release were determined less by the formal logic of the criminal justice system than by the diplomatic calculations of governments. British intelligence and the Foreign Office understood from early in the Cohens' imprisonment that two known and valued KGB assets with deep institutional relationships inside Soviet intelligence represented a significant bargaining resource in the informal exchange economy that both Cold War sides had developed. The Soviet Union had British subjects it was holding, and the general framework of prisoner exchanges had become an accepted, if unofficial, diplomatic mechanism. The specific exchange that ultimately secured the Cohens' release centered on Gerald Brooke, a British lecturer who had traveled to the Soviet Union in 1965 to distribute literature on behalf of the NTS, the National Alliance of Russian Solidarists, a Russian émigré organization based in the West that the Soviet government regarded as a hostile anti-Soviet formation. Brooke was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in a Soviet labor camp. After completing his sentence, he was held for additional time rather than being released, a pattern that British officials came to understand was the Soviet side signaling its interest in a negotiated arrangement. Brooke was being retained as a bargaining chip against the eventual release of the Krogers. He was a lecturer who had carried pamphlets. The Soviet Union was prepared to release him in exchange for 2 professional intelligence officers who had spent their careers at the operational heart of KGB foreign intelligence. Both governments accepted the terms. On October 24th, 1969, Morris and Lona Cohen left England on a flight to Warsaw, Poland, from which they traveled to the Soviet Union. Morris Cohen was 58 years old. Lona Cohen was 56. They had been in British prisons for nearly 9 years. In Moscow, they were received with the particular warmth that the KGB and the Soviet state extended to loyal assets who had endured imprisonment without breaking, who had accepted the consequences of the work they had agreed to do without compromising the institutions and colleagues they had served. The Soviet Union awarded both of them the Order of the Red Banner and additional state honors in recognition of their decades of service. They were provided with an apartment in Moscow, pensions, and the various practical supports that the KGB extended to retired assets of their standing and demonstrated reliability. After more than 2 decades of aliases, Morris and Lona in New York, Peter and Helen in Ruislip, they were officially acknowledged within the institution that had recruited and directed them as themselves, as Cohens, with their true histories, their true names, and their true significance finally and formally recognized. In Moscow, they lived quietly. Lona's health had been affected by the years of imprisonment, and she moved with less energy than she had before. The Soviet Union that had dispatched them to New Mexico in 1945 and to Ruislip in 1954 was, by the time of their return in 1969, a substantially different place than the one they had served, less ideologically electric, more bureaucratically rigid, in the grip of the Brezhnev-era stagnation that had settled over Soviet public life after the relative openness of the Khrushchev years. The Russia they came home to was not the revolutionary project they had joined as young people in New York in the 1930s. It was an empire in the middle of its long plateau before decline. They were celebrities of a closed kind, honored within the institution, invisible to the public, living in a world that had been transformed around the ideology they had served at such cost. Morris remained somewhat more publicly active within the closed world of the Soviet intelligence community, occasionally meeting with trainee officers and providing operational accounts that were valued as institutional history by a service that took its own heritage seriously. Both received formal recognition from the KGB and its successor organizations as exemplary figures in the history of Soviet intelligence, though the specific nature of their most consequential contribution, the atomic courier work, the summer of 1945, the Kleenex box on the train, was managed carefully in terms of what could be publicly acknowledged and what remained within the classified institutional record. Lona Cohen died in Moscow on December 23, 1992. She was 79 years old. She had outlived the Soviet Union by almost exactly 1 year. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had formally dissolved on December 25, 1991. She died in the city where the intelligence she had carried across the American Southwest in the summer of 1945 had been received, processed, photographed, analyzed, and used to build a weapon that altered the balance of power for half a century. The country she had served, the ideology she had held, the institution that had sent her to New Mexico, and then to Ruislip, and then brought her back to Moscow. All of it had ceased to exist in the year before her death, rendered into history by forces whose origins were complex, and whose acceleration in the final years of the Soviet system its founding architects could not have foreseen. Morris Cohen died in Moscow on June 23, 1995, at the age of 84. He had outlived his wife by 2.5 years and outlived the Soviet Union by 4 years, and died in a Russia that was navigating the bewildering aftermath of a collapse that had left the institutions he had served technically dissolved, but practically continuous in many of their functions. His funeral was attended by officers of the FSB, the Federal Security Service, the primary institutional successor to the KGB, who paid formal respects to one of the Soviet intelligence service's most consequential assets. Theodore Hall was not publicly identified as a Soviet intelligence asset until 1995, when the National Security Agency declassified the Venona transcripts. The codename MLAD, alongside the operational details of his contact with Soviet intelligence and the substance of what he had provided, appeared in the public record for the first time. The declassification of the Venona material in 1995 was one of the most significant historiographical events of the post-Cold War period, establishing with documentary precision a history of Soviet intelligence penetration of American institutions during the 1940s that had previously been assembled only from fragments, confessions, defective testimony, circumstantial evidence, and educated inference. The transcripts confirmed things that had been suspected, established things that had been actively disputed, and provided the definitive evidentiary foundation for histories of Cold War espionage that had previously been contested. They confirmed that Lona Cohen, Leslie, had performed the atomic courier run and that Theodore Hall, MLAD, had provided the material she carried. Hall was by then in his early 70s, long retired from active scientific work, living quietly in Cambridge. The statute of limitations on espionage offenses had long since expired. No prosecution was legally contemplated. Hall gave a small number of interviews in which he acknowledged what he had done and offered explanations consistent with what he had told FBI agents in 1951. He spoke about his fear of an American monopoly on atomic weapons. He spoke about his inability at 19 to fully calculate the consequences of what he was choosing. He said he was not proud of it, but could not say, given what he had understood at the time, that he would have decided differently. He died in Cambridge on November 1st, 1999, at the age of 74. He had been a physicist, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a colleague remembered warmly by those who had worked beside him at the Cavendish. He had also, at 19 years old, while employed at the most classified research facility in American history, provided information to a foreign intelligence service that helped that service build an atomic bomb years before it could otherwise have done so. Both of these things were true simultaneously and without contradiction. The second does not undo the first, any more than the first explains away the second. His daughters had grown up knowing something of their father's history, at least in the outline that a family could discuss across the years. How they navigated the space between the father they knew and the act he had committed before they were born is not something they have discussed publicly. That space is real and does not close simply because the act is historical and the consequences are complex, and the man who committed it is gone. Saville Sachs, the man who had carried Hall's initial contact to Soviet intelligence in New York and who had served as the intermediary in Albuquerque in the summer of 1945, was also interviewed by the FBI in 1951. He too was never charged for the same evidentiary reasons that prevented charges against Hall. He went on to live an ordinary life, working various positions, and was described by people who knew him in later years as periodically and genuinely troubled by what he had done as a very young man. He died in 1980. The cardboard Kleenex box Lona Cohen carried from Albuquerque to New York in the summer of 1945 does not survive. The documents she concealed inside it were photographed and the photographs transmitted to Moscow. What happened to the original papers after that point is not established in the available record. The box, the tissues, the folded diagrams, all of it was ephemeral by design, intended to serve a purpose in a specific moment and not to persist beyond it. What persists are consequences. The Soviet atomic test of August 29th, 1949 changed the structure of international relations in ways whose effects remain embedded in the architecture of the contemporary world. In nuclear non-proliferation treaties, in the doctrine of deterrence, in the existence and purpose of international bodies created to manage the risks that atomic weapons introduced into the world, in the calculations of every government that has since sought or been denied or voluntarily renounced nuclear capability, the Cold War that followed, the proxy conflicts in Korea and Vietnam and across the developing world, the arms races, the surveillance states on both sides, the civil defense drills, the generations who grew up understanding that the world could end by design, was shaped in some portion by what Lona Cohen carried, by the specific summer afternoon when the most consequential set of technical drawings in modern history traveled east in a box of tissues on a passenger train. The moral assessment of the people involved resists simplification, as it should. Theodore Hall was not a mercenary. He believed in the genuine and tortured way that 19-year-old idealists sometimes believe things, that what he was doing would make the world safer. Lona Cohen was not a fanatic. She was a woman who had come to political conviction through comprehensible paths, and who acted on that conviction with discipline and courage over decades. Morris Cohen was not a monster. He was a man who had fought in Spain against fascism, who loved his wife and his parents, and who had made a series of decisions in the years before. He fully understood what those decisions would cost. None of this excuses the choices they made, but it does require that those choices be understood within the full context that produced them, the specific historical moment, the specific social formations, the specific intellectual frameworks that shaped what options seemed available and what consequences seemed real or abstract. The world of 1944, in which a 19-year-old physicist at Los Alamos decided to contact Soviet intelligence, was a world in which the Soviet Union was an allied power, in which the shared enemy was fascism, in which the dominant fear was German atomic capability, and in which the full meaning of what a Soviet atomic arsenal would imply for the post-war order had not yet resolved itself into clarity. This does not make Hall's choice correct. It does make it comprehensible, which is a different and more honest thing. The question that historical cases like this one inevitably raise, and rarely answer, is whether the people involved understood what they were actually doing, as opposed to what they believed they were doing. Hall believed he was contributing to a balance of power that would reduce the risk of catastrophic war. He helped create a balance of terror that held the world hostage for 4 decades. Lona Cohen believed she was serving a cause that stood on the right side of history. The cause she served built labor camps, crushed uprisings, and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. These gaps between intention and consequence are not incidental features of these cases. They are, in a very real sense, the story. The history of the 20th century is substantially a history of people acting on convictions that seemed, from inside their own frameworks, self-evidently correct, and producing outcomes that bore only a partial and often ironic relationship to what they had intended. What the Venona decrypts confirmed, and what historians have subsequently documented in detail, is that the Soviet intelligence penetration of the Manhattan Project was more extensive, more systematic, and more consequential than most Americans understood during the Cold War itself. It was not a matter of a few idealists acting on private conscience. It was a coordinated effort by a professional intelligence service to acquire, through human assets with access, the scientific knowledge that would allow the Soviet Union to build atomic weapons on an accelerated timeline. The Cohens were part of that effort. Hall was part of that effort. Fuchs was part of that effort. Each of them, acting for their own reasons within their own frameworks, contributed to an outcome that none of them, individually, had designed. That is how consequential history is usually made, not by single decisive acts of individual will, but by the accumulation of smaller decisions made by multiple people operating in parallel, whose combined effect exceeds anything any of them separately intended or anticipated. None of this excuses the choices they made. None of it relieves the consequences those choices produced. It only makes those consequences more difficult to assign cleanly, which is the appropriate response to history that is genuinely complex. The populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore the consequences of decisions they had no part in making. The populations of both superpowers bore the consequences of a nuclear standoff they had not chosen and could not escape. The daughters of Theodore Hall bore the private weight of a history their father created before they were born. The parents of Morris Cohen spent years not knowing whether their son was alive. All of them were, in the fullest sense of the word, civilians in a war conducted without their knowledge or consent, bearing consequences assigned to them by the choices of others. The bungalow at 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip still stands. Unremarkable from the street, is history visible only to those who know where to look. Holloway Prison, where Lona Cohen served 8 years, was closed in July 2016 and has since been redeveloped. The Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, where Theodore Hall worked and where he died, continues to operate. The Union Station in Albuquerque still receives passengers traveling through the high desert of New Mexico. None of these places announces what passed through it. None of them needs to. The history is in the archives, in the Venona transcripts, in the partially released Soviet files, in the interviews Hall gave before he died, and the accounts the Cohens gave to their KGB debriefers over the years. It is a history that took decades to become visible, and that is still not completely visible. Documents remain classified, participants died without speaking fully, and the specific texture of individual decisions made in 1944 and 1945 cannot be recovered from any file. What the record contains is enough to understand the shape of what happened. The rest belongs to the irreducible privacy of minds and moments that no archive preserves. Lona Cohen was 32 years old on the afternoon she boarded the eastbound train in Albuquerque. She was 56 when she left a British prison. She was 79 when she died in Moscow, having outlived the state she served. In between, she had lived inside the specific silence that her work required, the permanent inability to tell the complete story of oneself, the necessity of maintaining identities that were simultaneously real and constructed, the knowledge that the most consequential thing she had ever done must remain, for very long periods of time, entirely unacknowledged. She was not a physicist, not a policymaker, not a general. She was a woman in a cotton dress, carrying a small cardboard box, boarding a train on a summer afternoon going home.